She never dreamed she'd see her own reflection in the polished marble floors of a billion-dollar mansion. Yet there she was, a shy waitress watching the arrogant CEO who once dismissed her stand utterly speechless at the threshold. Clara Pennington was the sort of person you might easily overlook in a bustling cafe. At 22, she blended into the scenery, slim in build, soft-spoken by nature, and possessed of a gentleness that rarely attracted attention, except from regulars who appreciated her warm smile. She spent the last year serving coffee and sandwiches at Riley's Diner, a quaint establishment along the edge of downtown, where the only drama was the occasional customer barking about a wrong order. Mostly, Clara moved through her shifts unnoticed, overshadowed by the louder, more flamboyant servers who boasted bigger personalities. She'd become a fixture at the diner after graduating high school, never having found the means, or perhaps the confidence, to pursue higher education. Though she had a quiet determination and a quick wit beneath her unassuming exterior, she rarely let either show. Life had taught her early that drawing attention could be risky business, and with no stable family to rely on, Clara had learned to treasure her own company, create her own security, and avoid disruptions that might shatter her delicate peace. On the day that changed her life forever, Clara had arrived at the diner just before dawn. She fumbled with her keys at the back entrance, as she always did when opening the shop. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly, revealing the chrome-plated counters and rows of empty booths. The air smelled faintly of frying oil and stale coffee, as if the ghosts of countless breakfasts past still lingered. She thought it would be a typical day. She'd brew coffee, greet customers with a polite nod and a subdued "good morning," and wipe down the counters whenever the steady trickle of patrons dipped. She had no reason to suspect a single thing was amiss until the door opened at 8:30 sharp, releasing a gust of cool air into the warm diner. In walked a man in a crisp navy suit, flanked by an assistant carrying a weathered manila folder. Even from a distance, Clara recognized the newcomer as Colton Hawthorne, the CEO of Hawthorne Global Investments, one of the city's most powerful figures. He was tall with meticulously styled hair, the sort of man who walked as if the ground bowed beneath him. She'd seen him on the local news more times than she could count, always exuding a cocksure demeanor that made even the camera crew seem subservient. She'd never had reason to cross paths with him until now. His assistant whispered something into his ear, and Colton's gaze swept the space. It was as if the diner was beneath his notice, a place so far removed from his lofty existence that even breathing the coffee-scented air might offend him. Yet he did not leave. Instead, he walked further inside, scanning the laminated menu on the wall. It was rare to see someone so obviously wealthy in this unassuming place, and Clara froze, feeling as though she were glimpsing a creature from another world. When he approached the counter, he didn't speak to her directly at first, only glanced dismissively at her name badge as though verifying some list in his mind. His assistant set the manila folder down. "Miss Pennington?" the assistant asked, voice curt. Clara nodded timidly. "Yes," the assistant slid the folder across the counter. "You are requested at Winston, Fletcher, and Avery law offices at your earliest convenience." "Me?" she asked, brow furrowing. She couldn't fathom why any law firm, let alone one of the city's most prestigious, would need her. The assistant just nodded, face revealing nothing. "The details are in the folder." Clara cast a quick glance at her boss, who was wiping down a table on the other side of the diner. He looked equally perplexed. "Oh, okay," she murmured, opening the folder. Inside was a single card with a time and address and a short note. "Please bring a valid ID. Your presence is urgently needed for the reading of a will." Her heart fluttered. A will? She didn't know anyone with enough money or property to bother with a fancy law office. The only relatives she had were distant cousins in another state, people she'd never really met or had lost contact with after her parents passed. Colton Hawthorne, who had remained silent, finally spoke. His voice was low and measured, with an undertone of condescension. "I suggest you don't keep them waiting," he said. Her pulse quickened. All right. She went to inform her boss that she needed to leave. She feared his disapproval, but for once he seemed astonished enough to wave her on. As she grabbed her purse from the break room, she overheard Colton say something to his assistant in a clipped tone. "She doesn't look like she belongs anywhere near Winston's offices." Clara's cheeks burned, but she left without a word. Anxiety twisted in her stomach. Who had died, and why was she needed? She had no illusions of coming into money. That sort of fortune was for other people. She half expected to discover some kind of bizarre mistake. The law office was intimidating from the moment she walked in. Plush carpets, mahogany furniture, and a row of private meeting rooms told her she was in a world far from any she had known. Nervously, she reported to the receptionist. Within minutes, a stern-faced lawyer with silver-gray hair gestured for her to follow him down a corridor. They entered a small, quiet room. A single polished table stood in the center, and to her surprise, Colton Hawthorne was already seated at one end, fingers drumming on the gleaming surface. He barely acknowledged her presence as she sat down at the opposite side. "Thank you for coming, Miss Pennington," the lawyer said, taking a seat. He had a warm, paternal quality in his voice that helped soothe the panic fluttering in her chest. "My name is Graham Fletcher. I represent the estate of Ms. Eleanora Kingston." Clara blinked. The name rang a distant bell. She scrambled mentally, trying to recall where she'd heard it. Then it clicked. Her late mother had once mentioned a distant relative named Eleanora, a woman rumored to live in Europe and rarely be in contact with the family. Clara hadn't realized that she might be a serious connection. "Ms. Kingston named you as a significant beneficiary in her will," Fletcher continued calmly, flipping open a portfolio on the table. "Her estate includes some properties, most notably a mansion in the Lakeview district and a few other holdings." Clara's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry, did you say a mansion?" "Yes," Fletcher replied, adjusting his glasses. "Valued at over $1 billion when factoring in its real estate worth and the precious art, antiques, and other historical assets it contains." Colton Hawthorne let out a slight scoff, though he remained largely impassive. It was as if the situation amused him, though an underlying tension in his posture suggested otherwise. I don't understand," Clara whispered. "Why me?" Fletcher offered a polite smile. "Ms. Kingston left a letter explaining her reasons, which you may read when you visit the property. Suffice to say, she named you her heir." For a moment, Clara didn't breathe. The folder in front of her suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She was a waitress with no grand ambitions, no substantial savings, and very little worldly experience. The idea of owning a mansion so valuable didn't just feel impossible, it felt like a cosmic joke. "How does this involve him?" Clara asked quietly, stealing a glance at Colton. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Mr. Hawthorne was an associate of Ms. Kingston's for many years, handling certain investments and philanthropic endeavors on her behalf. He's here to ensure the transition of her estate is seamless and to advise on the best ways to handle your newfound responsibilities." Clara wanted to laugh out loud. The idea of a man like Colton Hawthorne, who had more wealth in his cufflinks than she could ever imagine, advising a simple waitress was surreal. But the look on Colton's face was carefully controlled, every emotion locked behind his polished exterior. Nevertheless, she sensed his disapproval. Maybe he'd expected to inherit something himself. Maybe he thought she had no business stepping into the shoes of a woman as esteemed as Eleanora Kingston. The potential tension between them weighed in the air. Her hands trembled as she signed the initial documents. Fletcher explained that the official reading of the will would take place in a week, but for now, they needed her signature to begin transferring certain assets into her name. Clara listened, overwhelmed. She felt like she was floating in a bizarre dream. At last, Fletcher closed his folder, signifying the end of the meeting. "Miss Pennington, I can arrange for you to see the mansion this afternoon if you wish." She hesitated, wanting to run back to the safety of the diner and act like nothing had happened, but curiosity overrode her nerves. "Yes, I'd like that." A faint glimmer in Colton's eyes hinted at something akin to reluctant curiosity. He stood up, adjusting his sleeve cuffs. "I have business to attend to, so I'll meet you there," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Before Clara could respond, he was already striding out of the room, leaving behind an air of both condescension and interest that made her insides twist. The first visit Clara arrived at the Lakeview district in a borrowed taxi. Her old sedan had sputtered out months ago, leaving her reliant on public transport and the occasional favor from friends. Her stomach churned as the taxi glided between ornate gates that towered over the wide driveway. Beyond them, the mansion rose like a fairy-tale fortress, tall spires, sweeping balconies, and a shimmering fountain out front that cast dancing reflections on the meticulously trimmed hedges. She stepped out onto the gravel driveway, half expecting someone to laugh and tell her there had been a mistake. Her worn sneakers felt sacrilegious on the pristinely raked stones. Taking slow, measured breaths, she approached the massive wooden doors. Before she could knock, one of them swung open. A woman in a neat black uniform stood there, her posture impeccably straight. "Miss Pennington, I'm Gloria, the house manager. Welcome." Clara managed a shaky smile. "Thank you." Gloria ushered her inside, and the first thing that struck Clara was the marble flooring, a continuous expanse of white veined with gray, polished to a mirror shine. The second was the grand staircase sweeping up into an upper gallery lined with portraits in gilded frames. Everything exuded a sense of timeless elegance. Leading her through the foyer, Gloria began a tour with a practiced efficiency. She showed Clara cavernous rooms, a library with row upon row of leather-bound books, a music room with a century-old grand piano, a sunroom that overlooked manicured rose gardens, and more bedrooms than Clara could count. Every turn revealed priceless art, plush furnishings, and architectural details that spoke of old money refinement. As they rounded into the formal dining room, Colton appeared from an adjacent hallway, his expression stern. He wore a tailored suit that seemed more fitting for a boardroom than a stately home. "So you've decided to see what you're getting into?" he asked, folding his arms. Clara bristled at his tone. She was shy, but she wasn't made of air. "I'm trying to understand why Ms. Kingston chose me." His lip twitched. "That's the billion-dollar question." Gloria, sensing the tension, discreetly excused herself, leaving the two of them alone in the dining room, beneath a chandelier that sparkled like 1,000 tiny suns. Clara swallowed. "Did you know her well?" A flicker of something passed over his face, pain, regret, or maybe just annoyance. "I knew her financially. I handled her investments. She trusted me with certain philanthropic pursuits, but personally, not quite as much." He studied Clara's uncertain posture. "What's important now is that you learn how to manage this place. A house like this isn't just a building. It's a full operation, maintenance staff, archivists, security. Are you prepared for that?" Her cheeks colored. "I am not sure." He gave a non-committal shrug. "If you need guidance, you know where to find me." Something in his tone suggested he expected her to fail, expected her to hand everything over to professionals and fade back into obscurity. Maybe that was the path many would take. Perhaps even he was counting on it, thinking that once she realized the magnitude of her responsibilities, she'd throw her hands up and let him take charge. She bit her lip, a small surge of determination lighting within her. "I'll figure it out," she said, her voice steadier than before. "I owe that much to Ms. Kingston." A faint smirk touched his lips, though it carried little warmth. "As you wish." Settling into wealth, the next few days passed in a haze of paperwork and guided tour of her new domain. Clara still worked at the diner, partly out of a sense of loyalty, and partly because she was too overwhelmed to quit without a plan. While she navigated 1,000 details about the mansion, like ensuring the staff was paid, reviewing security protocols, and learning about the valuable antiques, she also clocked in every morning at Riley's diner, wearing her worn-out uniform with a name tag that read Clara. News of her inheritance spread quickly among her coworkers. Reactions ranged from awe to disbelief. Some teased her, calling her Your Majesty, while others eyed her with envy, as if waiting for her to waltz in wearing a tiara. Rumors flew about how long she'd keep working there. She had become the talk of the diner, though she maintained her usual humility, focusing on clearing tables and refilling cups. But beneath the chatter lay a growing tension. The more she stepped into her role as mistress of the mansion, the more she felt a subtle tug from Colton Hawthorne's world. He made it clear that to truly handle her new estate, she needed to learn about trusts, asset protection, and philanthropic obligations. She found herself scheduling awkward meetings with financial advisors who spoke in a language she barely understood. One evening, after a grueling day of balancing diner work with a meeting about art preservation, she returned to the mansion exhausted. Gloria greeted her with a respectful nod, but expressed concern about the staff's confusion. Were they to expect a more hands-on approach from the new owner, or would she be an absentee figurehead? Clara, who couldn't fathom letting anyone down, promised she'd be more present. That night she wandered into the library alone. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, and the soft glow from a Tiffany lamp illuminated a tapestry of old books. She trailed her fingers along the spines, pausing at a volume of classic literature. Despite her shaky confidence, she felt a swell of something, hope perhaps that she could grow into this unexpected role. Reaching a plush armchair, Clara sank into it, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She opened the old volume and found a letter tucked inside, sealed with a wax stamp bearing a stylized K. Carefully, she pried it open. "My dear Clara," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I have entrusted you with a gift beyond measure. Perhaps we never had the chance to sit down to tea and discuss the intricacies of life. But I have watched you from afar, through channels you might never suspect, and I believe you possess the heart and spirit this estate needs." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She read on, absorbing Eleanor's words about family legacy, about wanting a fresh perspective for the mansion's future. The letter concluded with a plea to keep the soul of the house alive, to not let it become just another piece of real estate. Clara's heart clenched. She had to do this justice. She had to be worthy of this trust. Clashing with the CEO as days turned into weeks, Clara tried to juggle both her old life and new responsibilities. She soon realized it was impossible to give her best to either. Sleep became a luxury. She'd rush from the mansion's demands in the morning to the diner's rush hour, then back to the mansion for late-night calls with accountants or curators. She finally faced the truth. she had to leave her job at the diner. It pained her because it was all she'd known. She broke the news to her boss, who, despite some teasing about being replaced by a billionaire heiress, actually gave her a hug and wished her luck. Word of her departure spread. On her last day, a few regular customers turned up to say goodbye, each curious about her improbable windfall. Clara blushed through it all, offering shy thanks and assurances she'd visit. Yet the moment felt like the end of a chapter, a farewell to her old identity as a timid waitress. From then on, her life revolved around the estate. With each new step, she sensed Colton Hawthorne watching her, sometimes literally, as he came by to discuss investments or philanthropic engagements. His presence unsettled her. He was usually polite in a distant way, but she could tell he questioned whether she was capable. One evening, she walked into the mansion's study to find him standing at a large window, gazing out onto the manicured grounds. Moonlight cast sharp angles across his face, giving him a statuesque stillness that made Clara's heart pound with unease. "How's it going, Miss Pennington?" he asked without turning around. She stiffened, unsure if his question was genuine or laced with sarcasm. "I'm managing, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm overseeing repairs to the East Wing, and Gloria has me meeting with a historical society representative tomorrow." Finally, he turned. "So you're determined to keep the house's history intact?" She nodded, hugging a sheaf of papers to her chest. "It was important to Ms. Kingston, and it feels right." He pressed his lips together. "It might be more profitable to sell off certain pieces, modernize the estate." A spark of defiance flared in Clara's chest. "I'm not looking to gut it for profit. It's not about money." He arched an eyebrow. "$1 billion property, and you're telling me it's not about money? That's naive." Her cheeks heated. "I never asked for any of this. But I have it now, and I want to honor Ms. Kingston's wishes." Silence stretched between them, charged and tense. Eventually, he inclined his head in a small, ironic bow. "As you wish, heiress, but just remember, sentiment doesn't pay bills." She stared at him, unsure whether to be furious or intimidated. He was so sure he was right, that the world revolved around cost-benefit analyses, but Clara clung to the hope that there was room for heart in this new life. Amid the chaos of adjusting to her new role, Clara began to notice oddities around the mansion. Doors that were supposed to be locked appeared unlocked, lights flickered in empty corridors, and she occasionally heard footsteps in the middle of the night. Gloria assured her it was just the staff moving about, but Clara grew uneasy. Then one morning she woke to find a painting missing from the gallery wall. It was a small seascape, not the most valuable piece, but its sudden disappearance jolted her. She questioned the staff, but no one had moved it. She called Colton, who arrived within the hour, unusually tense. "Are you certain it was there yesterday?" he asked, scanning the empty spot on the wall. "Absolutely," Clara said. "Gloria keeps a meticulous inventory." Together, they went through security footage, but the cameras conveniently glitched for a 3-hour window the night before. Suspicion gnawed at Clara's mind. Who would risk stealing a piece from her estate, and why? Later that afternoon, she received a cryptic note slipped under her door. "Be careful who you trust." There was no signature, no clue as to who sent it. She showed it to Colton, but he only frowned. "Likely just some disgruntled opportunist," he said. "I'll tighten security." Clara bit her lip. A tremor of fear traced her spine. She wondered if the theft was a random act or something more personal, something targeting her specifically. Despite their rocky start, Clara found herself depending more on Colton's guidance. His knowledge of financial structures, estate management, and security protocols was indispensable. Late-night phone calls turned into shared coffee over spreadsheets. She learned to read him in subtle ways, the tightness in his jaw when frustrated, the gleam in his eyes when discussing a brilliant investment strategy. Little by little, she sensed he wasn't as impenetrable as he seemed. Occasionally, a comment slipped about his strained relationship with his father or the sacrifices he made to reach his position. Once, she even caught him massaging his temples, exhaustion evident in his features, reminding her that under the polished exterior he was human. A strange camaraderie began to form. They were both bound by Eleonora's mansion, one the surprised heiress, the other the stoic advisor. Neither had asked for this exact scenario, yet here they were, forging a delicate alliance. "Clara," he said one afternoon in the mansion's vast library, dropping the formality of calling her Miss Pennington, "your charitable accounts are due for a review. Are you sure you don't want to liquidate some assets for philanthropic funds?" She chewed on the end of a pen, scanning the proposals. "Some maybe, but not the historically important items. I'll put some of my personal accounts toward the donations." He lifted an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly generous." She shrugged. "Ms. Kingston wrote about using her resources for good. It only makes sense." A wry smile touched his lips. "You really believe that, don't you?" She blinked. "Of course." He said nothing more, just gazed at her with an inscrutable expression, as if he were simultaneously impressed and perplexed. As the mansion settled into its routine under Clara's leadership, the mystery of the missing painting remained unsolved. Then came a second theft. An antique vase disappeared from the sunroom. Security footage failed them again, capturing only static during the crucial hours. Clara's nerves frayed. She called the police, who investigated, but with no evidence the case stalled. Colton brought in a private security firm, installing more cameras, sensors, and even employing a discreet guard to patrol the grounds. Tension mounted, casting a shadow over the estate's grand halls. One evening, Clara found a new note slipped beneath her door, written in the same anonymous scrawl, "You don't belong here." The words sent ice through her veins. She showed it to Colton, who read it with a clenched jaw. "It's a coward's intimidation tactic," he said. "Don't let them scare you." Easier said than done, she thought. She was already out of her depth managing a mansion this size, and now she had to worry about a thief or saboteur lurking in the shadows. Some nights she lay awake, staring at the vaulted ceiling of her opulent bedroom, questioning every choice that had led her here. Amid the fear and uncertainty, Clara dug deeper into the mansion's archives. She hoped to uncover any clue about Eleanor's history that might explain why the estate was being targeted. She sorted through old letters, diaries, and estate logs, sometimes staying up until dawn. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that she discovered a sealed envelope marked, in delicate handwriting, with Colton's name. Curiosity warred with caution. It felt wrong to open something clearly intended for him, yet it might hold answers. Unable to quell her curiosity, she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a typed letter from Eleanor Kingston. "My dear Colton, I know your ambitions and I respect them. But the mansion needs someone with a pure heart to guide its next phase. That's why I have chosen Clara. I hope you will set aside your pride and offer her genuine support. In return, I've left you a key to your own happiness, an inheritance less tangible than property, but far more valuable if you embrace it." The letter concluded cryptically. Clara's heart pounded. She realized Eleanor had orchestrated this scenario deliberately, pairing her with Colton in a way that forced them both to confront aspects of themselves they'd kept hidden. She resealed the envelope and tucked it away, resolving to give it to Colton. Next morning, she found him in the main hall, directing some staff about the new security system. Nervously, she approached. I found this in the archives," she said, holding out the envelope. He took it, eyes narrowing. "Addressed to me," she nodded, half expecting him to lash out or accuse her of snooping, but he said nothing. He stepped aside to read it in private. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was unreadable. "Did you read it?" he asked quietly. She flushed. Yes, I'm sorry. I was looking for clues about the thefts, and I stumbled on it." He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders momentarily relaxing. "I suppose it doesn't matter. Eleanor always had a flair for drama. She believed we both had something to learn from each other." Clara mustered her courage. "What is the key to your own happiness?" she wrote about. A flicker of vulnerability crossed his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, almost inaudibly. "Maybe it's not meant to be taken literally." She nodded, deciding not to press him further. The moment felt oddly intimate, as if they were two people standing on the precipice of understanding, not just each other but also themselves. Determined to prove she deserved her new position and to protect the mansion, Clara threw herself into learning every facet of estate management. She set up scholarship funds in Eleanor's name, opened the library to local students on certain weekends, and organized charity events in the manor's grand ballroom. Every time she executed these plans, she noticed Colton observing, sometimes lending advice on logistics, sometimes silently watching from the sidelines. The staff responded positively to Clara's warm leadership style, and with each small success, she felt her confidence bloom. In the midst of planning a high-profile charity gala, Clara enlisted Colton's assistance to attract potential donors. Standing side by side in the study, they pored over invitations. He pointed out a few strategic names, leaning in so close that she caught the faint scent of his expensive cologne. "Don't forget to invite the city council members," he said, tapping the list. She nodded, scribbling notes. Of course. Their proximity felt charged. She glanced up at him, catching his gaze. An unspoken tension lingered, a pull between two unlikely allies who had started at opposite ends of the social spectrum. Shaking off the momentary distraction, Clara busied herself with the papers. "That should be everyone," she said, exhaling. "I can't believe I'm hosting a gala here." He smirked, but there was a hint of genuine pride. "You've come a long way from serving coffee at the diner." She offered a half smile. "Feels like another lifetime." The night of the gala arrived. The mansion dazzled, every chandelier lit, every marble surface polished to a reflective sheen. Guests in formal attire flooded in, marveling at the estate's grandeur. Clara, dressed in an elegant gown that Gloria had helped her choose, stood at the top of the grand staircase, greeting each arrival with composure that surprised even herself. In the past, she would have shrunk from the spotlight, content to remain in the shadows. But tonight, she embodied her new role, hostess, patron, and keeper of a legacy. She felt the ghost of Eleanora Kingston somewhere nearby, guiding her, proud of her. Colton circulated through the crowd with a practiced ease, speaking to influential donors and local celebrities. From across the room, he caught Clara's eye. There was something like admiration in his gaze. He nodded subtly, and she nodded back, her heart swelling with gratitude for the chance to prove herself. The event proceeded smoothly. Classical music floated from a string quartet, elegantly attired waiters served canapés, and philanthropic pledges began rolling in. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, and celebrated the mansion's storied past while investing in its philanthropic future. Just as Clara thought the night couldn't be more perfect, a hush fell over the crowd. The doors to the ballroom swung open. 4 police officers stepped inside, followed by a glowering detective and a man in cuffs. It was one of the security guards hired to patrol the estate. Murmurs rippled through the assembled guests. Clara and Colton hurried over. The detective approached Clara, tipping his hat. "Miss Pennington, we've arrested this man on suspicion of the art thefts. We received a tip he was conspiring to steal valuables during tonight's gala." The guard in cuffs spat. "It's not fair. That old lady's fortune is wasted on her." He glared at Clara. "You're nobody. You don't deserve this place." Colton moved protectively in front of Clara, anger flashing in his eyes. "You have no right," he began, but Clara gently touched his arm. "Officer," she said quietly, voice trembling slightly, "thank you for acting quickly." As the culprit was led away, Clara finally comprehended the cryptic threats and missing items. It had been an inside job, orchestrated by someone bitter enough to sabotage her. The hush in the ballroom turned into a collective sigh of relief as guests realized the threat was contained. Yet the shocking drama only added to the evening's intrigue. Some donors even increased their pledges, praising Clara for her composure in the face of adversity. By midnight, the gala was hailed as a resounding triumph. Once the last guests had left, Clara wandered back into the now empty ballroom. The band had packed up, and the caterers were cleaning. The overhead lights illuminated a space that just hours before had thrummed with life. She slumped onto a vacant chair, exhaustion pressing down on her. Colton appeared at her side, loosening his tie. "You handled that well," he said softly. "I'm impressed." The admission seemed to cost him some pride, but it was genuine. She managed a small laugh. "I'm not sure I would have said the same thing a year ago." He studied her, an emotion in his gaze she couldn't easily label. "You've become someone I never expected," he murmured. She looked down at her trembling hands, remembering the frightened waitress she used to be, shyly placing plates in front of impatient customers. Now she stood as the caretaker of a grand estate, forging philanthropic endeavors, unearthing secrets, and facing thefts with courage she didn't know she possessed. "I guess sometimes life throws you into the deep end," she said, "and you learn to swim." He chuckled, a warmth in his eyes. "Indeed." They lingered in silence for a moment, the only sounds the distant clink of glassware being collected. Eventually, Colton spoke again, voice quieter. "Eleanora chose well. She saw something in you." Clara felt tears threaten to escape. She blinked them away, smiling. "She helped me see it, too." When Colton walked her to the main foyer, they paused at the foot of the grand staircase. The hush of the night enveloped them, broken only by the faint rustle of the staff tidying up. "Clara," he began, hesitating. "I need to thank you." She tilted her head. "For what?" He slipped a folded piece of paper from his pocket, the letter from Eleanora. "I used to think she was testing me, punishing me for being too ambitious. But after seeing how you've taken on the estate's responsibilities, I realize it wasn't a punishment. It was a lesson." A gentle flush warmed Clara's cheeks. "I'm not sure I follow." He exhaled, gaze drifting to the grand surroundings. "I was so focused on numbers and profit that I forgot places like this hold more than monetary value. They carry history, memories, a spirit that needs caring for." He looked back at her. "You reminded me that sometimes heart matters more than bottom lines." She offered a wavering smile. "Thank you for helping me navigate all the financial complexities. I wouldn't have managed without you." He ran a hand over his hair, a hint of humility in the gesture. "You're more capable than you know." At that, Clara felt an undeniable shift between them, an unspoken understanding, a bridge spanning their once very different worlds. She wondered if Eleanora had planned not only to entrust her mansion to a shy waitress with a good heart, but also to impart a deeper lesson to a driven CEO who'd lost sight of intangible values. They parted with a soft goodnight. Clara climbed the grand staircase, each step echoing in the cavernous halls, her heart filled with a quiet gratitude for how life had twisted her path from waitress to heiress. She was no longer the timid girl who avoided eye contact with customers. She was the steward of a storied legacy, forging her own place in the world. Over the following weeks, the estate continued to flourish under Clara's balanced oversight. She formed committees to preserve historical artifacts, launched community outreach programs, and even set up a small art gallery open to the public once a month. Colton, though initially skeptical, found himself contributing willingly to her vision. Together, they ensured the mansion wasn't just a monument to old wealth, but a living, breathing center of culture and charity. The staff adored Clara's humility and kindness, donors admired her passion, and the city welcomed her philanthropic spirit. The once arrogant CEO stood by her side more often than not, learning that sometimes the best investments are those that can't be measured in mere dollars. In many ways, his initial speechlessness in the foyer that very first day had become emblematic. The shy waitress had inherited more than just a building. She'd inherited the power to transform lives, starting with her own. She never dreamed she'd see her own reflection in the polished marble floors of a billion-dollar mansion. Yet there she was, a shy waitress watching the arrogant CEO who once dismissed her stand utterly speechless at the threshold. Clara Pennington was the sort of person you might easily overlook in a bustling cafe. At 22, she blended into the scenery, slim in build, soft-spoken by nature, and possessed of a gentleness that rarely attracted attention, except from regulars who appreciated her warm smile. She spent the last year serving coffee and sandwiches at Riley's Diner, a quaint establishment along the edge of downtown, where the only real drama involved the occasional customer complaint about an overcooked egg or a forgotten side of ketchup. Mostly, Clara moved through her shifts unnoticed, overshadowed by louder, more flamboyant servers who attracted the bigger tips. She had become a fixture at the diner after graduating high school, lacking the resources or the confidence for college. Though she had a sharp mind and a quick wit, she rarely let that intelligence show. Life had taught her early on that attracting attention could lead to chaos or heartbreak, and she valued her safe little bubble of anonymity. Perhaps it was because she had no stable family of her own. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she had no siblings, that she'd learned to get by on her own terms, taking comfort in a predictable routine. On the morning that changed her life forever, Clara arrived at the diner around 5:30, as she did whenever she worked the opening shift. She fumbled with her keys at the back entrance, yawning away the last vestiges of sleep. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed, revealing the chrome-plated counters and rows of empty booths. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale coffee, remnants of 1,000 breakfasts served before dawn. She settled her bag in a locker, tied on her apron, and prepared to greet the regulars who'd trickle in once the sun rose. Everything seemed normal until roughly 8:30, when an unusual hush fell over the chatter of hungry customers. Into the diner stepped a man in a crisp navy suit, flanked by an equally serious-looking assistant. Even from a distance, Clara recognized him, Colton Hawthorne, the CEO of Hawthorne Global Investments, a man rumored to navigate high-stakes financial ventures as casually as one might browse a menu. He was tall, confident, radiating an aura of power that turned heads wherever he went. Clara's heart pounded. She couldn't imagine why a man like him would set foot in Riley's Diner, where most patrons wore construction boots or dressed in business-casual clothes at best. A hush fell over the place, the usual clatter of plates giving way to curious stares. Some of her coworkers whispered excitedly, but no one dared approach him. Clara instinctively straightened her posture, feeling oddly self-conscious. Then Colton stepped up to the counter, meeting her eyes just long enough to read her name badge. His gaze flickered across her features, not with interest but with an almost dismissive acknowledgement, as though verifying a detail on a checklist. "Miss Pennington," his assistant asked, voice clipped. "Yes, that's me," Clara replied, voice quivering slightly. The assistant pulled out a manila folder. "You are requested at Winston, Fletcher, and Avery law offices at your earliest convenience. The information is here. Please read it." Clara blinked in confusion. She glanced at her boss, who was hovering near the coffee machine, just as perplexed as she was. Swallowing hard, she opened the folder. Inside was a single card bearing a date, a time, and a short note instructing her to bring valid identification for the reading of a will. A will. She felt a rush of heat under her collar. She barely knew anyone who would even consider leaving her money, certainly no one who'd employ a high-powered law firm. Perhaps this was some mistake. Her eyes flicked to Colton Hawthorne, whose expression remained impassive. He spoke at last. "I suggest you don't keep them waiting," he said, his voice deep and threaded with condescension. Nodding numbly, she looked to her boss for permission to leave. He shrugged, startled and uncertain, but told her to go ahead. Clara slipped off her apron, grabbed her purse, and hurried out the door. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the winter air stung her cheeks. A swirl of questions flooded her mind. Whose will was she named in? Why had Colton Hawthorne of all people shown up to deliver the message? And what exactly did Winston, Fletcher, and Avery want with her? Her anxiety mounted as she rode the bus across town. The law office was a towering structure of glass and steel, an intimidating sight for someone more accustomed to the low-slung diner counters and neon signs. She signed in at the front desk, was directed to the 32nd floor, and soon found herself in a plush waiting room lined with abstract paintings. She smoothed her sweater, feeling wholly out of place. "Miss Pennington," came the voice of an older man in a tailored suit. He extended his hand. "I'm Graham Fletcher. Please come this way." He led her into a private conference room. Colton Hawthorne was already seated at one end of a polished table. His fingers drummed the surface, and he barely spared her a glance. Fletcher closed the door and indicated a seat for Clara. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Fletcher began, settling into a chair opposite them. "We represent the estate of Ms. Eleonora Kingston." Clara's mind spun. She did recall distant mentions of someone named Eleonora, a distant relative of her mother's side, if memory served. She never met the woman in person. How could she possibly be involved in the reading of this will? "Ms. Kingston has passed away," Fletcher continued gently, "and she named you as a principal beneficiary. We have the paperwork here." He slid a stack of documents across the table. Clara's eyes roamed the text, struggling to process the lines that outlined extensive properties, significant investments, and a mansion valued at over $1 billion once its treasures and historical artifacts were considered. She couldn't comprehend the zeros, couldn't fathom how her name was suddenly tied to such enormous wealth. "That must be a mistake," Clara whispered, cheeks burning. "I didn't even know her personally." Fletcher's expression was kind but firm. "She left a personal letter for you, explaining her reasons. You'll find it in the paperwork. For now, understand that you stand to inherit the mansion and all accompanying assets." Colton cleared his throat. Given the size of the estate, this transition will involve lawyers, accountants, and, he gave Clara a skeptical glance, significant management responsibilities. She looked between the two men, confusion and panic warring in her chest. I'm a waitress. I have no idea how to manage a mansion." Fletcher gave a sympathetic smile. "We can help guide you through the basics, but yes, it's a substantial responsibility." Colton leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully controlled. "I've been overseeing some of Eleonora Kingston's financial interests for years, which is why I'm here." She wanted continuity. "That means I'll be around to advise you on the estate's affairs, if you choose to keep me on." The very idea of working side by side with a man of such wealth and arrogance made Clara's stomach do flips, yet she could see the practicality. She had no idea how to manage an inheritance of this magnitude. For the rest of the meeting, Clara tried her best to focus on Fletcher's explanation of how the estate would be transferred, the steps to secure various assets, and the timeline for the official reading of the will. She signed some preliminary forms, her hand unsteady. At last it was over, and she left clutching the folder like it was a live grenade. Colton Hawthorne swept out of the room ahead of her, not bothering with pleasantries. A moment later, she overheard him mutter to his assistant, "She's completely out of her depth." Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She was sure he was right about that, but the scorn in his voice stung. She felt like a child in front of a room full of adults, except the stakes were astronomical. Nevertheless, she had to see what she was now responsible for. That afternoon, as if stepping into a surreal dream, Clara found herself traveling to the Lakeview district, a part of town she'd only ever glimpsed from bus windows. She recalled scenic vistas of shimmering water, massive gates, and mansions that looked more like castles. She never imagined she'd set foot there, let alone inherit one of those mansions. After a nerve-wracking taxi ride, the driver navigated through towering wrought iron gates that opened with an electric hum. The driveway was expansive, flanked by manicured hedges and immaculate gardens. At its end stood a sprawling estate, a testament to old-world architecture, complete with spires, balconies, and a majestic fountain in front. Stepping out onto the gravel, Clara felt dwarfed by the mansion's grandeur. She paused to catch her breath, her heart thudding in her chest. Everything about the place, its sheer size, the centuries-old design, the possibility of priceless antiques, intimidated her beyond words. A woman in a crisp black uniform opened the giant front doors. "Miss Pennington, I'm Gloria, the house manager. Welcome." Clara forced a polite smile. "Thank you, I appreciate it." Gloria led her through a grand foyer with marble floors that gleamed under the soft light of a massive chandelier. A sweeping staircase curved up to an upper gallery lined with gilded portraits. Each step Clara took echoed, her worn shoes feeling glaringly out of place against such opulence. At the end of the foyer, a tall door led to an expansive drawing room where Colton Hawthorne stood, hands in his pockets, surveying the surroundings like he owned the place. His expression was unreadable, a polished mask of neutrality. "You made it," he said by way of greeting. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice shaking. Gloria began a tour, showing them room after room. The study, the library, with more books than Clara had ever seen in one place. The formal dining hall, multiple kitchens, galleries of art, winding corridors, and enough bedrooms to house a large extended family. The scale of it all left Clara dizzy. In every room, she saw evidence of Eleanor Kingston's refined taste. Ornate wallpaper, high-quality furnishings, antiques carefully placed to showcase the mansion's history. Clara felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. Yet, according to the documents she'd signed, this was now her home. At one point, Gloria discreetly stepped aside, leaving Clara and Colton alone in the mansion's grand library. A hush settled over them. Colton ran his hand along a mahogany table, then turned to face her. "This place is more than just a house," he said quietly. "It's an institution. It costs thousands of dollars a day just to keep it running. Staff, upkeep, security, insurance. Have you considered what you're going to do?" Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know yet." He nodded, neither mocking nor overly sympathetic. "You'll need guidance. This level of inheritance isn't something you can handle alone." Though she resented his superior tone, she knew he was right. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'll do my best." A flicker of something, approval, maybe crossed his face. But he said nothing more. Instead, he stepped past her, footsteps echoing on the marble floor, leaving her to stare after him and wonder if he viewed her as a mere inconvenience or something more. That night, Clara stayed in the mansion for the first time, occupying a guest bedroom that felt larger than her entire apartment. She couldn't sleep. She explored the corridors in her pajamas, flicking on lights, whispering apologies to the ghosts of the past for disturbing their domain. Eventually, she settled in the library, where she discovered Eleanor Kingston's letter tucked in a well-worn book of poetry. "Dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means I've passed and left you my estate. You may wonder why. The truth is, I kept a distant watch over you, knowing you had no family to lean on. I saw you at the diner once, though you never knew me. Your kindness, your humility, your patience, they reminded me of qualities our family once treasured but lost in the pursuit of status. I believe you'll care for this mansion's legacy with heart, not just with wallet. Trust yourself, even when others doubt you. And never forget that fortune in all its forms is best used to uplift others as well as yourself." Warmly, Eleanor Kingston tears blurred Clara's vision. She hugged the letter to her chest, wishing she could have met Eleanor in person, if only to say thank you. The next day brought lawyers, appraisers, and financial experts. They all explained the complexities of inheriting a billion-dollar estate. Clara listened, overwhelmed. Taxes, trust funds, philanthropic obligations. She'd stepped into a labyrinth where every turn led to new responsibilities. Colton was present at many of these meetings, offering his expertise. His presence both comforted and unsettled her. She needed his knowledge, yet his cool demeanor never let her forget how out of place she was. Meanwhile, rumors about Clara's inheritance spread like wildfire through her old neighborhood. The diner buzzed with gossip. Some of her coworkers were thrilled for her. Others seemed resentful or envious. Suddenly, she was no longer just Clara the waitress, but Clara the billionaire heiress. She clung to her old job for a week, trying desperately to maintain a semblance of her former routine. Every morning, she rose early to help open the diner. But as word leaked out, customers pestered her with questions. Was she going to keep working? Could she buy the diner now? Did she have a private jet? She began to dread the attention. Then, after her shift, she'd rush to the mansion to deal with staff management or meet with accountants. By the week's end, she was utterly exhausted. "Clara, you can't keep doing both," her boss said gently when she approached him about cutting her hours. "You've inherited a fortune. Go figure out how to manage it." Torn between gratitude and fear, Clara finally stepped away from the diner. On her last day, she teared up when regular customers handed her goodbye cards, some containing small tokens of affection. She realized how much the place had meant to her, how the diner had been her safe haven, her anchor in a drifting life. Now she was afloat in a sea of unknowns, yet part of her brimmed with a new, cautious hope. Maybe she could do something meaningful with Eleanor Kingston's inheritance. Maybe she could help others the way no one had been able to help her when she struggled. The thought emboldened her. Soon after, she decided to open part of the mansion to the public. Specifically, the library and certain galleries that showcased historical art. She consulted with a local historical society, forging a plan to preserve the mansion's heritage while allowing the community to benefit from its cultural value. The staff, under Gloria's direction, adjusted to the idea. Some were hesitant, allowing strangers into the home felt risky, but Clara insisted it was the right move. It was during these preparations that peculiar incidents began. One morning, Clara discovered a valuable vase missing from the sunroom. Security footage for that specific area mysteriously glitched, showing only static during the time of the theft. A week later, a small painting disappeared from a side corridor. Again, security footage failed. Clara felt a chill each time, as though someone were testing her resolve. She confided in Colton, who ordered an immediate upgrade of the security system. He also hired additional guards, a move that put the staff on edge. The mansion, once a quiet repository of old money, was fast becoming a fortress. That wasn't the only trouble. Clara began receiving anonymous notes under her bedroom door, each one more threatening than the last. The first read, "You don't belong here." Then came "Mind your step, princess." She shuddered to think who would go to such lengths. Perhaps it was an opportunistic thief, or maybe it was someone who felt wronged by Eleanora Kingston's choice. Colton urged her to stay calm but vigilant. For the first time, Clara saw real concern in his eyes, not the practiced courtesy he usually displayed. Their relationship had grown slightly less frosty over the weeks. She still sensed his underlying skepticism, but there was also a grudging respect. After all, she hadn't run away or sold the estate for a quick profit. Instead, she was trying to fulfill what she believed were Eleanor's intentions, using the mansion as a place of community, art, and learning. Late one night, unable to sleep, Clara roamed the halls with a flashlight. The hush of the mansion's corridors felt almost eerie. She passed tapestries that seemed to watch her, eyes woven into the fabric, capturing scenes from centuries past. Eventually, she found herself in a cramped, dusty room filled with stacked boxes. She peeked inside a few, finding old letters and journals belonging to the Kingston family. As she read the faded script, she felt an uncanny closeness to Eleanora and her ancestors, learning about their triumphs, their heartbreaks, and their philanthropic endeavors over generations. She also found more letters referencing other potential heirs, relatives who had squandered their chances due to greed or recklessness. It seemed Eleanora had been searching for someone different, someone who cared less about money and more about preserving what mattered. The discovery spurred Clara's determination. If Eleanora had chosen her specifically, she had to be worthy of that trust. She began working closely with historians and art curators, ensuring every piece in the mansion was cataloged and protected. She also set up a small scholarship fund for local students, naming it the Kingston Pennington Fund. This philanthropic turn didn't go unnoticed by the city's influential circles. Invitations to charity events arrived in droves. Soon, Clara found herself attending black-tie galas and luncheons, accompanied at times by Colton, who guided her through the maze of high society. Despite her shy nature, she tried to represent Eleanor's estate with grace, using these appearances to raise awareness for causes she deemed important. Yet for all her efforts, she still felt like an outsider, especially when speaking to wealthy patrons who sometimes regarded her as a curiosity. A rags-to-riches story, the Waitress heiress. She often caught whispers about her in corners of opulent ballrooms. She'd duck her head, wishing she could vanish, only to remind herself that if she was going to honor Eleanor's legacy, she needed to stay present, engaged, and unafraid. In the midst of these events, tensions between her and Colton ran hot and cold. They'd clash over financial decisions. He preferred more aggressive investments, while she was cautious and wanted to focus on preserving capital and historical artifacts. He'd argue that she was neglecting opportunities to grow the fortune, while she'd counter that not everything was about maximizing profit. More than once, they left each other's presence fuming, only to reunite out of necessity to handle yet another pressing matter. One late afternoon, the two of them were in the estate's study, surrounded by ledgers and documents. Clara had just vetoed a plan to sell a portion of land adjacent to the mansion grounds, which Colton believed could generate significant returns if developed. "Why won't you at least consider it?" he asked, his tone verging on exasperation. "That land is just sitting there, and the capital we could raise. I'm not trying to turn this place into a profit engine," Clara interrupted, voice trembling with pent-up emotion. "This land is part of the estate's integrity. Eleanor's letter, she said to preserve the spirit of the place. She didn't want it gutted for money." He ran a hand through his neatly styled hair, frustration evident. "You're letting sentiment blind you." She shook her head, tears threatening. "Maybe I am, but I think that's why Eleanora chose me, because I'm not like everyone else who just sees dollar signs." For a moment, Colton said nothing. Then he sighed. "All right, we won't sell, but you have to know refusing these deals might limit the estate's long-term growth." She mustered a watery smile. "Maybe some things are more important than growth." He studied her, an unreadable expression in his gray eyes. She sensed a crack in his armor of wealth and power, a glimpse of understanding. "We'll see," he said quietly. Over time, a curious camaraderie developed between them, still marked by tension but tempered by mutual respect. They both had Eleanor's legacy in mind, albeit from different angles, but trouble was brewing behind the scenes. The stolen antiques were a small part of a larger threat. Clara began receiving phone calls at odd hours with no one on the other end. Letters arrived with cryptic warnings about her, stepping outside her station. The staff grew anxious, whispering that the estate was under a cloud of malice. Even Gloria looked worried, though she tried to hide it. Determined to bring the culprit to justice, Clara and Colton hired a private investigator, a middle-aged woman named Irene Franklin who had a reputation for being discreet yet relentless. Irene interviewed every staff member, pored over security logs, and examined the glitchy camera footage. Little by little, patterns emerged. In the meantime, Clara attempted to keep her life as normal as possible, though normal had become a relative term. Her new normal involved extensive calls with lawyers, philanthropic planning sessions, and the occasional social function that tested her nerves. Her old friends from the diner texted her sometimes, but she sensed a growing distance between them. They lived in different worlds now, and bridging that gap felt harder each day. Still, she often dropped by the diner to say hello, sometimes bringing muffins or small gifts. Her coworkers would pepper her with questions, half in jest and half in awe. Did she drive a fancy car yet? Did she have a personal chef? She'd blush, admit that yes, the mansion employed a chef, but she still found herself sneaking peanut butter and jelly sandwiches late at night. A few days later, the private investigator Irene requested a confidential meeting with Clara and Colton. They convened in the estate's small parlor, a place rarely used, with plush chairs and thick drapes that kept the conversation private. Irene spread out a series of documents on a coffee table, including staff rosters, phone records, and notes from interviews. "I've identified one possible suspect," Irene said, tapping a name on the list. It was a security guard hired through the new firm, a man named Roberto Kane. "He has a questionable past, accusations of theft in other states, though never convicted. I'm not certain he's the mastermind, but he's definitely connected to the missing vase and painting." Clara's heart pounded. "Is he still on the payroll?" "Yes," Irene replied grimly, "but I recommend we terminate his contract and alert the police. I have enough evidence to at least warrant an investigation." Colton nodded, setting his jaw. "Agreed, let's move swiftly." They did just that. Within hours, the security company was informed, and Roberto was taken off duty. A day later, the police arrived to question him. He denied everything, accusing Clara of paranoia. But by the week's end, they'd recovered the missing vase and painting from his girlfriend's apartment. Roberto was hauled away in handcuffs, shouting profanities and threatening Clara. "Doesn't matter that you have fancy papers," he yelled as the police led him past the estate's gates. "You'll regret thinking you're better than the rest of us." Clara's legs trembled at the vehemence in his voice, but she steadied herself. Colton, standing beside her, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It was the first openly comforting gesture he'd ever offered. "It's over," he murmured. "He won't threaten you again." Yet the sense of violation lingered, and Clara couldn't help wondering if Roberto was acting alone or if someone else had orchestrated the entire scheme. The cryptic notes under her door suggested someone with deeper access, someone who might still be inside the mansion's walls. As weeks passed, no further thefts occurred and the ominous notes ceased. The staff, relieved, resumed their routines. Clara tried to believe that they had contained the threat. Maybe it had just been Roberto and his accomplices all along. Amid this relative calm, she had a chance to focus on her first major philanthropic event, an open house gala at the mansion to raise funds for the local children's hospital. She planned to invite donors, local dignitaries, and even members of the general public who wished to see the estate's art and architecture up close. It was an ambitious plan that would test her ability to host large-scale events and prove to the city that she was more than just a novelty heiress. For 2 months, she worked tirelessly, coordinating with event planners, caterers, musicians, and security teams. The staff polished the mansion's floors until they gleamed like mirrors. Florists decorated the gardens with vibrant arrays of seasonal blooms. A string quartet was booked. Local news outlets promised coverage. Clara's nerves frayed under the mounting pressure, but she powered through, determined to honor Eleanora Kingston's legacy by opening the mansion's doors for a worthy cause. The day of the gala arrived under bright sunshine. Guests began arriving in their finest attire, streaming through the mansion's gates, greeted by uniformed attendants. The library, once a private sanctuary, was transformed into a public exhibition space showcasing rare books. The ballroom, previously silent, now echoed with classical music and hushed admiration for the mansion's ornate decor. Clara stood at the top of the foyer's grand staircase to welcome guests. She wore a tasteful gown, not overly extravagant but elegant enough for the occasion. Her heart drummed in her chest, but she maintained a poised smile. Once or twice, she spotted a familiar face from her old life, looking up at her in awe. It felt surreal, as if she were an actress on a stage. Colton moved through the crowd with ease, making introductions, talking up potential donors. He had a knack for conversation, whether discussing global markets or praising the good work of the children's hospital. Several times he caught Clara's eye and offered an encouraging nod, wordlessly telling her she was doing fine. She guided small tour, recounting tidbits of the mansion's history she'd gleaned from Eleanor's journals. Many were enthralled, not just by the opulence but by the sincerity in Clara's voice. She wasn't merely showing off a wealthy estate, she was inviting people into a grand legacy meant to be shared. Then came the surprise everyone talked about long afterward. As the afternoon wore on, the large doors to the ballroom swung open once more, and a group of children entered, patients from the hospital, accompanied by nurses and guardians. Their eyes lit up in wonder at the sight of the chandeliers and gilded walls. Clara had arranged this special visit to let them experience the mansion firsthand, to remind everyone why they were raising funds. Tears glistened in more than a few eyes as these young patients navigated the stately room. Clara knelt down to greet them, all shyness momentarily forgotten. She explained the artwork in gentle, whimsical terms, pointing out hidden details in the murals that she'd loved discovering herself. The children giggled, asked questions, and marveled at everything around them. A hush settled over the crowd, replaced by a hush of admiration. Camera shutters clicked. Journalists whispered about the genuine warmth in Clara's gestures. Even Colton paused, struck by the scene of his once shy business partner guiding children through the halls of an ancient estate like some benevolent host. Donations poured in that day, exceeding everyone's expectations. The local news hailed the event as a triumph, praising Clara's heartfelt vision. That night, when the final guest departed and the staff began cleanup, Clara wandered out to the garden alone. The moon shimmered on the fountain's surface, and the fragrance of freshly watered roses perfumed the air. She let out a long, shaky breath, hardly believing what she'd just pulled off. She'd gone from an anonymous waitress to hosting a high-society gala that raised tens of thousands of dollars for a children's hospital. Eleanor Kingston's choice had given her the platform, but she had made it her own. A quiet step behind her made her turn. Colton emerged from the shadows of a manicured hedge. Without his usual formal posture, he seemed almost relaxed. He stood beside her, gazing at the moonlit fountain. "That was impressive," he said at last. "I haven't seen such a well-received charity event in a long time." She offered a small smile. "It's not about impressing people, it's about helping those kids." He tilted his head, conceding the point. "True, but you also brought the mansion to life in a way that was remarkable." Clara studied his face, wondering what had changed in him. He looked different, not the aloof CEO who first walked into the diner, but a man who'd recognized something deeper in the estate's purpose. "Thank you," she replied simply. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the gentle burble of the fountain. Eventually, Clara mustered the courage to speak the thoughts that had been circling in her mind for weeks. "You know," she began softly, "I never asked for any of this. I didn't even know Eleonora. But she saw something in me, something I still can't fully grasp. I'm trying to live up to that." Colton crossed his arms, his gaze distant. Eleonora was very perceptive. She saw potential in people the rest of the world overlooked. She turned to him, curiosity piqued. "Like you," he gave a short laugh. "Perhaps. She was my mentor in some ways, taught me about philanthropy when all I cared about were profits. I didn't always listen, but maybe I'm starting to understand what she meant." Clara's heart fluttered with a mix of empathy and intrigue. "She left you something, didn't she?" He hesitated, then nodded. "A letter, telling me to find what truly matters, beyond the spreadsheets and the bottom lines. I didn't know how to take that at first, but seeing what you've done here, maybe this is exactly what she wanted me to witness, a different kind of legacy." Moved by his openness, Clara lightly placed a hand on his sleeve. "I think we can figure it out together. I might be shy and inexperienced, but I do know how it feels to want a purpose in life." His eyes searched hers, and for a moment it seemed like all pretense fell away. They were just two people who'd been thrust into a strange, shared destiny by a woman who believed in them both. Before either could say anything more, the sound of someone clearing their throat startled them. Gloria stood a polite distance away, informing them that a journalist had requested a final statement from Clara before the staff wrapped up. Colton stepped back, restoring his composed demeanor. "You go ahead. I'll handle the rest of the logistics inside." She nodded and followed Gloria, her mind still swirling with the echo of the conversation. That night, long after she'd given her final interviews and thanked every staff member, Clara returned to her bedroom. She had never truly decorated it. It remained a lavish space that still felt foreign to her. She glanced at Eleonora's letter on her nightstand. She wondered if Eleonora's spirit was watching, pleased at how the evening had turned out. Soon, the local newspapers sang praises of Clara's successful fundraiser. Her name began circulating in philanthropic circles, and more invitations arrived. Yet even with this rising profile, she tried to stay grounded, focusing on her mission to keep the mansion's spirit alive rather than turn it into a mere spectacle of wealth. In the weeks that followed, she directed funds into renovating a wing of the estate into a small community art center. She found local painters, sculptors, and photographers who needed a space to showcase their work. This move sparked some disagreements with Colton again, who worried about liability issues and the cost of constant public access, but he ultimately relented when he saw how passionately she believed in it. Meanwhile, the private investigator Irene continued her quiet vigilance, certain there was more to the mansion's troubles than one rogue security guard. Subtle signs supported her suspicion. A recently hired maid was caught snooping in locked rooms, suspicious phone calls were traced to pay-as-you-go devices, and someone hacked into the mansion's security network. Though no further items went missing, it felt as though someone was biding their time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Clara grew more cautious. She changed her bedroom to a different part of the house, not telling anyone but Gloria about the switch. She also asked for an off-site location to store the most valuable heirlooms. She wanted them safe, especially if someone intended to target her or the estate again. Still, her daily life marched on, a balance of philanthropic initiatives and routine administrative tasks. Oddly enough, she found she missed serving coffee and hearing ordinary stories from ordinary people. This new life was glamorous yet isolating, and she yearned for the sense of belonging that had once come so easily at the diner. Even so, she continued forging a path, step by timid step. One day, a local college invited her to speak to a group of first-generation students about her journey. She accepted, albeit nervously. Public speaking terrified her, but she felt she owed it to those who might be inspired by her story, that the improbable could indeed happen, and that even someone with humble beginnings could make a difference. The auditorium was modest, filled with attentive students clutching notebooks and water bottles. Clara stood at the lectern, her heart hammering in her ears. She began by describing her upbringing, her shy nature, and the diner job. She admitted she still struggled with feeling unworthy of Eleanora Kingston's inheritance. "But here's the thing," she said, voice trembling slightly. "I realized it's not about feeling like you deserve something. It's about deciding what you'll do with the opportunities life hands you, whether they're big or small. We don't always get to choose how we enter a situation, but we can choose how we respond." When she concluded, the applause that erupted was genuine and moving. Students came up afterward, asking if she had tips for finding scholarships or handling imposter syndrome. She spoke with each one patiently, recalling the nights she'd served coffee to people with big dreams but few resources. Driving back to the mansion, she felt a warm satisfaction. The shadows of intimidation that once haunted her began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose. She wasn't just preserving a legacy, she was helping others see possibilities in themselves, too. She arrived home to find Colton waiting for her in the foyer, holding a manila folder. He was on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. When he spotted her, he nodded goodbye to whoever was on the line. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing the tightness in his expression. He held up the folder. "Got some interesting data from Irene. It seems your name and the estate have been flagged in some suspicious overseas transactions. Money moving around shell companies that reference the Kingston property. We need to investigate this carefully." Clara's stomach dropped. "You think someone's using the estate as part of a money laundering scheme?" Colton exhaled, jaw clenched. "Possibly, or at least leveraging its name and your new status. It could be the reason behind the thefts and threats, someone wanting to scare you into cooperating or leaving." Fear pricked her, but she steadied herself. "Then we have to dig deeper. I won't let them hijack what Eleanora worked so hard to preserve." He nodded. "I agree. Let's go upstairs to the study and figure this out." They pored over the documents for hours, analyzing bank statements and cryptic wire transfers that Irene had uncovered. Deeper they went, the more convoluted the paper trail seemed, tying back to shell corporations with no clear owners. A pattern emerged involving small sums funneled through numerous channels, as though someone were testing the waters before a bigger move. Eventually, exhaustion set in and they decided to resume in the morning. As they stood to leave, Clara paused by the window, staring at the moonlit gardens. It struck her how often trouble seemed to stalk her in this mansion, yet she refused to cede the ground. "Clara," Colton said softly, coming up behind her, "we'll handle it. We'll hire forensic accountants, coordinate with law enforcement, whatever it takes." She nodded, comforted by his resolve. The mansion's reflection in the glass felt symbolic. She saw herself in that grand silhouette, transformed yet still vulnerable. This place had become her crucible, forcing her to confront dangers and responsibilities she'd never dreamed of facing. The next day, Colton brought in a specialized financial crimes team, who set up a makeshift office in one of the mansion's unused rooms. Computers hummed, files stacked high, and the staff gave the investigators a wide berth. During that hectic period, the estate felt more like a corporate headquarters than a home, a far cry from the tranquil grandeur it exuded when Clara first arrived. As tension mounted, an unexpected ally emerged, a senior attorney from Winston, Fletcher, and Avery who had decades of experience unraveling corporate fraud. She worked closely with Eleonora in the past and agreed to assist Clara pro bono, out of loyalty to the Kingston family. With her guidance, they traced the suspicious transactions to an international syndicate known for targeting wealthy estates, funneling illicit money under the guise of property deals. A plan began forming to expose the criminals. The investigators recommended staging a fake transaction that would lure the perpetrators into revealing themselves. Colton was hesitant, worried about Clara's safety, but she insisted on playing her part, wanting to confront whoever was behind this assault on her inheritance. When the day of the sting operation arrived, Clara could hardly keep her hands from shaking. She wore a wire per the investigators' instructions and sat in a small meeting room with a man who claimed to be a private investor, interested in purchasing some old farmland attached to the mansion's property. The man was smooth-talking and courteous, but a cold gleam in his eyes set Clara's nerves on edge. They discussed terms. Clara pretended to consider selling, feigning interest in the man's offer. Beneath the table, her foot tapped anxiously. Outside, Colton and the investigative team listened via an earpiece, ready to intercept at any sign of malfeasance. "So," the man said finally, sliding a piece of paper across the table, "you'll sign this agreement, and in return we wire the funds to your account in the Bahamas. Everything remains discreet." Clara peered at the paper, feigning interest in the sum. Then she pressed the small button on her watch, the signal to the investigators. "I'm curious," she said slowly. "Why do we need a Bahamas account for a local land sale?" The man's expression faltered. He tried to recover, but footsteps thundered in the corridor. In seconds, law enforcement burst into the room, guns drawn, ordering the suspect to freeze. As he was restrained, he snarled at Clara, face twisting with fury. "You had your chance," he spat. "You should have stuck to waiting tables." Clara's stomach churned, but relief flooded her that the man was now in custody. Outside, she found Colton waiting. His face displayed both anger at the criminal's words and profound relief that the operation was successful. The arrest that followed cut off the criminal syndicate's infiltration, revealing that they'd hoped to scare Clara into selling or funneling estate funds through their laundering channels. Roberto, the crooked guard, had been a smaller piece of a larger scheme. The ringleaders were now facing charges, and the estate was declared secure from further infiltration. In the aftermath, Clara sat down with Colton, Irene, and the senior attorney to review the final details. Exhausted, she brushed a strand of hair from her eyes. "I feel like this mansion is constantly under siege. Will it ever be peaceful?" The attorney patted her hand gently. "Eleanor's estate is high-profile and wealthy. It's a magnet for these types of schemes, but you've taken extraordinary measures to protect it. Going forward, I believe the worst is behind you." Clara allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She hoped they were right. In the following months, she refocused on the positive developments. The Community Art Center was finally open, providing a free creative space for local artists and students. The Children's Hospital Gala had become an annual event, raising ever-increasing donations. Clara visited local shelters, donating funds to expand their services. She found herself on the board of several charities, using the mansion as a central hub for philanthropic brainstorming sessions. Her relationship with Colton continued to evolve in subtle ways. There were moments when she felt a genuine bond forming, an understanding built on shared adversity. Other times, they still clashed over finances, her idealistic approach clashing with his pragmatic outlook. Yet even those disagreements felt more collaborative than combative, as though they'd found a middle ground between heart and practicality. One late evening, Colton and Clara sat in the estate's library, each reading through documents and proposals. A single lamp illuminated their table, casting a warm glow on the leather-bound volumes lining the walls. Soft classical music played from a hidden speaker, filling the silence with a gentle melody. Clara set down her folder. "I've been thinking about starting a scholarship for kids who want to go into hospitality, cooking, serving, running a small business. Something that helps them if they don't have the money for college." Colton looked up intrigued. "Why hospitality?" She smiled wistfully. "Because that was my world. I learned so much about people, about hard work, about kindness from waiting tables. And not everyone wants to go into finance or law. Some want to open a bakery or manage a restaurant. Why shouldn't they have help too?" He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds like a cause worth championing. Maybe the mansion can host an annual culinary festival to raise awareness and funds for the scholarship." Her eyes lit up. "That's a brilliant idea." They exchanged a smile, one that communicated a shared vision. In that moment, Clara felt something inside her shift, a realization that the mansion had not only changed her life but could also be a beacon for others. Encouraged by that conversation, Clara threw herself into planning the new scholarship program. She reached out to local chefs, restaurant owners, and even some of her old coworkers from the diner, wanting their input on how best to structure it. The more people she involved, the more excited they became about the possibilities. However, no grand endeavor is free of obstacles. Bureaucracy slowed her down. There were permits to file, legal structures to create for the scholarship. At times, she became frustrated, feeling bogged down in red tape, but she pressed on, leaning on Colton and the legal teams for assistance. Eventually, the first Culinary Pathways Scholarship was launched, accepting applications from teens and young adults who had a passion for the hospitality industry. Clara personally reviewed many of the essays, moved by the stories of those who struggled financially but dreamed of running a kitchen or starting a catering business. Each essay reminded her of her own journey, of how a single spark of opportunity could change a life. When the first scholarship recipients were announced, Clara held a small reception in the mansion's sunroom. The new scholarships arrived with their families, some wearing aprons or chef's hats in excitement. She shook each of their hands, gave them certificates, and told them to visit any time they wanted advice or simply a quiet corner to study. A local reporter covering the event asked Clara how it felt to shift from waitress to benefactor. Clara smiled a bit shyly. "I haven't forgot my roots, and I hope I never do. This mansion may be grand, but I know what it's like to work for tips, to worry about rent. If I can ease that burden for others, I'm doing what Ms. Kingston wanted me to do, paying her kindness forward." The story spread, generating praise and also piquing the interest of more donors. Soon, Clara found herself awash in letters from restaurateurs wanting to volunteer, from cooking schools offering workshops for her scholarship recipients, and from media outlets seeking interviews about her philanthropic work. While it was overwhelming, it also felt deeply gratifying. She began to see how Eleanor's wealth could become a force for good, and how her initial reluctance was transforming into a sense of genuine responsibility and fulfillment. Colton, for his part, became something of a mentor to the scholarship recipients who were interested in the business side of hospitality. He found himself fielding questions about startup capital, marketing, and growth strategies. Although initially cautious about investing his time in such small-scale endeavors, he discovered a surprising satisfaction in guiding young entrepreneurs. He catch himself smiling when one of them had a breakthrough, a small success that might bloom into something bigger. Through these collective efforts, the mansion's reputation shifted. No longer was it merely known for its eye-popping value or rumored intrigues. It became a community hub, a place that symbolized hope and second chances. Tourists still came to admire its grandeur, but the locals saw it as more than just a relic of old money. It had heart. Meanwhile, Clara experienced personal growth that went beyond philanthropic achievements. She enrolled in night classes for estate management, wanting to formalize her knowledge. She gained confidence in public speaking, no longer trembling in front of cameras or large crowds. She also took better care of herself, realizing she needed mental and emotional balance to shoulder her new role. One day, as she walked through the manicured gardens with Gloria, now more a friend than just a house manager, she noticed how natural it felt to stroll these grounds. She recalled her first day when she stood trembling in the driveway, convinced she didn't belong. Now she understood that belonging wasn't just about heritage or privilege, it was about the willingness to care for something bigger than yourself. Yet amid her outward successes, life still held everyday trials. She had occasional nightmares about Roberto's threats, about the man with the cold eyes during the sting operation. She worried about letting Eleonora down. Sometimes she simply missed the comforting simplicity of the diner, the easy banter, the sense of being just another face in the crowd. But those longings no longer paralyzed her. They reminded her of where she came from and reinforced her commitment to remain grounded. Another test arose when an influential real estate mogul, Alastair Vernon, tried to buy out the mansion's adjacent land to develop luxury condos. He dangled astronomical sums of money, promising to turn the Lakeview district into a modern paradise. Clara refused, firmly stating that the land was part of the mansion's heritage and she had no intention of selling. Incensed by her refusal, Alastair launched a smear campaign, suggesting Clara was a naive heiress blocking progress. For a while, negative articles appeared in certain business journals. Anonymous posts online mocked her as an uneducated waitress clinging to relics of the past. But she held her ground. Colton stood with her, using his connections to counter the narrative. In the end, the city council ruled against Alastair's proposal, citing zoning protections tied to the mansion's historical status, a status Clara had methodically ensured was protected. After that victory, Colton found Clara in the library, reading an old book of poetry that had belonged to Eleonora. He sat down across from her, a rare softness in his eyes. "You handled that well," he said. "The old me would have sold, taken the money, and moved on, but you saw something more valuable, protecting the mansion's integrity." She set the book aside. "Money can do a lot of good, but it shouldn't rule every decision. I guess that's something I've had to learn the hard way." He smiled in a way that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I think we both did." They spoke for a while about how far they'd come, from that first awkward meeting in the diner to the endless negotiations, the battles against criminals, the philanthropic strides. Their conversation felt like a shared confession, an acknowledgement that Eleanora Kingston's legacy had changed them in ways they never anticipated. Soon after, Colton left to attend a conference in another state. The mansion felt oddly quiet without his steady presence, and Clara realized she'd grown used to his near-daily visits. He called occasionally to check in on estate matters, and she found herself looking forward to those calls more than she expected. Their conversations often drifted into personal topics, favorite movies, silly anecdotes from childhood. It was as though they were finally peeling away the last layers of formality. On the eve of a grand holiday ball that Clara had planned for a local charity, Colton returned from his trip. He walked into the ballroom, still in a travel-worn suit, pausing to admire the decorations, twinkling lights, evergreen garlands, a towering Christmas tree. Guests would arrive in a few hours, but for now the mansion was still. Clara stood in the center of the room, directing staff on final touches. She turned at the sound of footsteps, eyes brightening when she recognized him. "You made it," she said, setting down a wreath. "I was worried your flight would be delayed." He set his suitcase by the wall, glancing around at the festive decor. "I wouldn't miss this. Heard you've been planning it for months." She nodded. "It's for the new scholarship recipients, plus the Children's Hospital. We're combining a holiday celebration with another fundraising effort, and this time we're expecting even more participants than the summer gala." Colton smiled, a genuine warmth. "You've turned the mansion into the city's philanthropic epicenter in less than a year." "That's remarkable, Clara." Her cheeks heated at the praise. "I had help from you, from the staff, from everyone who believed in Eleanor's vision." They stood there for a moment, a hush settling, each taking in the other's presence. Clara noticed the subtle exhaustion in his eyes. "How was your conference?" He shrugged. "Productive, but I realized something. I kept comparing every venue to this mansion. Nothing felt quite as meaningful. It was all just business." She bit her lip, a soft smile forming. "You might be going soft," he laughed quietly. "Maybe, or maybe I've finally found something worth caring about beyond mergers and acquisitions." They left it at that, but the atmosphere between them felt charged with unspoken possibility. In the next few hours, guests arrived in elegant dresses and tailored suits. Laughter, music, and conversation filled every corridor. The holiday spirit infused the event with a warmth that even the mansion's highest ceilings couldn't dissipate. Clara made her rounds, greeting donors and community leaders. She paused by a lavish buffet table to check on the scholarship recipients, who were excitedly meeting new contacts. The Children's Hospital representatives arrived, some with patients whose conditions had improved thanks to earlier donations. Hugs, tears, and gratitude flowed freely. At one point, Clara caught sight of Colton standing near the piano, engaged in a friendly chat with an older woman who was praising the scholarship program. His gaze briefly flicked to Clara, and he smiled. She felt a surge of pride at what they'd built together, an alliance that transcended their initial misgivings. Midway through the evening, the band took a break, and Clara stepped onto a small platform to address the crowd. She thanked everyone for coming, for supporting the scholarship and the Children's Hospital. She shared stories of the scholarship winners, of how one aspiring chef was now interning at a renowned local restaurant, how another hoped to open a bakery in her old neighborhood. Applause punctuated each anecdote. Finally, her voice trembling with emotion, Clara said, "None of this would be possible without the legacy of Eleanora Kingston. She believed in the power of compassion, and all of your showing how right she was. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." The crowd erupted into cheers. As Clara stepped down, Colton was there, offering a quick congratulations. Without thinking, she reached out and squeezed his hand, just a moment of connection, fleeting and sincere. At the end of the night, when the last guests departed, the staff began their cleanup routine. Clara and Colton helped where they could, gathering stray decorations and half-empty glasses. Eventually, they found themselves alone again in the ballroom, near the towering Christmas tree that still shimmered with lights. "You've grown a lot," Colton said, his tone softer than usual. "You've turned this place into something even Eleanora might not have envisioned, a living heart of the community." Clara looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you. Even when we disagreed, you pushed me to be better." He reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. There's still plenty of work ahead, but I think we've proven we can handle anything. She nodded, and for a moment neither spoke. The lights danced across the polished floor, reflecting in their eyes. Outside, a snowflake drifted past the window. Eventually, they said goodnight. Clara ascended the grand staircase, her heart fuller than it had ever been, whispering a silent thank you to Eleanor Kingston. She felt the mansion's presence around her, no longer an imposing fortress of marble and history, but a cherished home that pulsed with life, hope, and love. The winter passed in a flurry of new projects and deeper connections. Clara officially filed legal paperwork designating sections of the mansion as public cultural heritage sites, ensuring future generations could visit and learn. She also invested in additional scholarships, expanding beyond culinary arts to include other hospitality fields. Media outlets began referring to her as a philanthropic rising star, which made her blush every time. At Colton's urging, she reluctantly allowed for some estate-driven investments that would create passive income to fund ongoing charitable efforts. In compromise, Colton agreed that no move would compromise the mansion's integrity or heritage. They found a balance, leveraging the estate's potential without sacrificing its spirit. With each day, Clara felt more comfortable in her role, more certain that she belonged. Shy by nature, she discovered a reservoir of strength when advocating for the causes she cared about. She found herself in city council meetings, passionately negotiating to increase local funding for homeless shelters. She hosted workshops for job seekers, using the mansion's staff to provide training in housekeeping, event planning, and culinary services. Amid these strides, she maintained her ties to the diner. She'd pop in occasionally, ordering a coffee at the counter, smiling at regulars who gaped at her newfound grace. Some teased her gently, "Don't you get fancy cappuccinos at the mansion?" But she'd laugh and say, "Nothing beats good old diner coffee." Through it all, the memory of Eleanor Kingston guided her. Clara often revisited the letter in the library, running her fingers over the words, "I believe you'll care for this mansion's legacy with heart, not just with wallet." Each time she felt grateful for the woman who had chosen her, a total stranger, to receive one of the greatest gifts imaginable. As the months slipped into summer, the estate's gardens bloomed magnificently. Vibrant flowers and lush greenery surrounded the mansion, providing a gorgeous venue for an outdoor charity luncheon. Clara decided to host a garden party to raise funds for a new adult literacy program, a cause dear to her, given how many late nights she spent reading educational materials to catch up on subjects she'd missed. Hundreds of guests arrived, strolling the gardens, enjoying live music and fresh seasonal dishes prepared by the estate's chef and scholarship interns. Laughter and conversation floated on the warm breeze. Clara wove among the attendees, wearing a simple sundress, greeting old friends and new donors alike. The sight of families exploring the rose-covered arches made her heart swell with contentment. Colton was there, talking with some business leaders under a canopy near the fountain. At one point, he caught her eye and waved her over. She joined the conversation, and soon they were discussing the possibility of a new small business grant for locals. Clara listened intently, occasionally chiming in with her perspective. She noticed how naturally she fit into these discussions now, how the old anxiety about not belonging had eased. When the sun began to set, Clara and Colton wandered deeper into the garden, away from the noise. They reached a quiet pond fringed by willows, golden light reflecting off the water's surface. Clara sighed happily. "Look at all this. It's almost like something out of a storybook." Colton gazed around, then at her. "It is." "You made it happen." Her cheeks warmed. "Not just me. You've been by my side this whole time." He smiled softly. Eleanor knew what she was doing when she put us together. They stood there in a companionable silence, the hum of distant chatter and laughter blending with the rustle of leaves. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass. In that quiet moment, Clara realized how far she had come from the timid waitress who froze when Colton first walked into the diner. Eventually, they headed back, rejoining the party for final goodbyes. Guests departed with smiles, some leaving generous checks for the literacy program. As the staff cleared tables and gathered decorations, Clara slipped off her shoes, relishing the cool grass underfoot. She was exhausted but exhilarated, proud of yet another successful event that furthered the mansion's mission of giving back. Over the following weeks, local newspapers ran headlines lauding Clara's philanthropic endeavors. Her once unbelievable inheritance was no longer the main story. Rather, it was her ability to use that inheritance to create tangible benefits. City officials praised her, calling her a breath of fresh air in a world often dominated by self-interest. By the time autumn leaves began to turn, the mansion was thriving, hosting regular community events, art exhibits, historical tour, and educational workshops. Volunteers streamed in, some drawn by the mansion's grandeur, others by Clara's earnest vision. She no longer felt overshadowed by the estate's vastness. She had grown to fit her role, her confidence matched by a humility that endeared her to nearly everyone she encountered. One crisp fall morning, Clara decided to revisit the very place where her journey had begun, Riley's diner. She walked in and inhaled the familiar aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon. Several heads turned, a couple of folks recognized her and gave a warm wave. She slid into a booth, remembering how many hours she'd spent wiping down tables here. Her former boss grinned when he saw her. "Well, if it isn't the world-famous philanthropist, you honor us with your presence." Clara laughed. "Stop it, I'm just Clara." They chatted about old times, about the wave of new customers who came by out of curiosity about her story. The boss joked that he should rename the place Clara's Diner and charge more for the eggs. She sipped her coffee, heart brimming with nostalgia. Before she left, she handed him an envelope. Inside was a check to fix the diner's leaky roof and upgrade some of the worn-out equipment. He tried to refuse, but she insisted. "I owe this place a lot," she said simply. "I want to make sure it's taken care of." He shook his head, overwhelmed. "Thank you, Clara. We always knew you were special." As she stepped outside, the chilly breeze ruffled her hair, and she thought about how everything had changed so drastically. Yet in her core, she still felt like the same shy waitress, grateful for small kindnesses. Maybe that was her greatest asset, the ability to remember what it was like to have little, so she never forgot the responsibility of having plenty. That afternoon, she returned to the mansion to prepare for a meeting with city representatives about expanding local literacy programs. Along the way, she stopped in the foyer, gazing up at the chandelier that shimmered even in the daylight. A wave of gratitude washed over her. This house, once a daunting behemoth, now felt like an extension of her own spirit, capable of sheltering art, education, community, and hope. Heading upstairs, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished handrail. She thought of that first day when she'd been overwhelmed by her reflection in the marble floors. The difference now was night and day. She saw someone who had learned and grown and dared to believe that she could change the world around her. In the study, Colton was waiting with a stack of documents. He glanced up when she entered, his gaze catching hers with a slight smile. "Ready for the meeting?" she nodded, setting down her purse. "Yes, let's do this." They dived into the paperwork, budget projections, draft proposals, volunteer rosters. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and occasional disagreements over details. Through it all, the synergy was undeniable, a harmonious blend of Clara's passion and Colton's expertise. When the city representatives arrived, Clara and Colton presented their plans seamlessly, each complementing the other's points. The officials were impressed with the clarity and depth of their proposal, and by the end, an agreement was reached to expand the literacy program into several districts. The visitors departed with promises of swift action, praising the mansion's role in spearheading such initiatives. After they left, Colton and Clara exchanged a triumphant grin. "We make a good team," Colton said. "Yes, we do," Clara replied. As the afternoon faded, they walked out onto the balcony overlooking the gardens. The sunlight caught the changing leaves, painting the landscape in oranges and golds. They stood side by side, the crisp air hinting at the winter to come. "Hard to believe it's been over a year since I first found you at the diner," Colton mused. Clara laughed softly. "You nearly gave me a heart attack that day." He leaned against the railing, looking thoughtful. "You've built something incredible here. Eleanor would be proud." She gazed at him, the breeze stirring her hair. "Thank you, I hope so. Sometimes I still wonder how I got chosen for all this." He shrugged gently. "Maybe the real question is how you choose to move forward." "And so far you've chosen well." Emotions swirled in her chest. She thought of everything they'd overcome: skeptics, thieves, corporate criminals, and her own doubts. Together, they had forged a new identity for the mansion and for Clara herself. She took a steadying breath and said softly, "Colton, there's something I've wanted to say for a while. I appreciate you, not just for your financial guidance, but for trusting me when so many people assumed I'd fail." His eyes flickered with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I appreciate you, too. You showed me that sometimes the best investments are made with the heart, not just the head." They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Below them, the staff began lighting lanterns in the garden, preparing for an evening event. The mansion glowed with warmth and promise, a beacon in the encroaching dusk. "Shall we go see how the volunteers are doing?" Clara suggested. Colton nodded, smiling. "Lead the way." Hand in hand, or at least side by side, they headed downstairs, ready to embrace whatever the night might bring. For Clara, it felt like the mansion had finally become a home, not just for her, but for everyone who believed in the power of compassion, generosity, and quiet resilience. And if there was one lasting image that would remain etched in her heart, It was the vision of the once arrogant CEO left speechless in the mansion's foyer, finally understanding that the shy waitress he'd underestimated had inherited not just a fortune, but a destiny far greater than either of them could have imagined. If you want to follow more incredible stories like Clara's journey from shy waitress to heiress, come visit my YouTube channel, where I share the hidden lessons behind life's most unexpected twists. Let's continue exploring the truth that sometimes fortune favors the humble, and even the most unassuming among us can shape a grand legacy.